When I walked into the company party, I didn't expect that night to turn into the most humiliating and defining moment of my life. I was tired, exhausted from the routine, but excited for a night of relaxation. I worked hard for years, earned respect and stability, built a life with the woman I loved, the one I swore I knew better than anyone. But there, before my eyes, everything fell apart in seconds. The music was loud, the room was illuminated by colorful lights, and people were laughing, toasting, talking loudly. I was looking for her, eager to see her in that dress she had mentioned earlier, the one I had praised myself when she asked if she should wear it. I liked seeing my wife feeling beautiful, I liked seeing her happy. But that's when I saw it. Another man. A man I knew. He held her hand so intimately, so securely, and pulled her onto the dance floor. She didn't hesitate. He didn't resist. He didn't back down. On the contrary. His laugh echoed, engaging, as if he were exactly where he wanted to be. As if that touch was something common, natural. Something that already existed before that night. I felt a weight in my chest, a cutting pain that shot up my throat, burning. The kind of pain you feel when you realize that everything you built has collapsed without you even noticing the crack in the base. My feet felt rooted to the ground, frozen between anger and disbelief. My heart, which had previously been beating at a steady rhythm, raced in a mix of adrenaline and despair. But, more than anything, came the outrage. I walked towards them. My firm steps, increasingly faster, driven by an uncontrollable impulse. As I stopped in front of them, the music seemed to die down, the faces around them began to turn, sensing the tension in the air. She laughed again, throwing her hair back. And then, his gaze met mine. A look that, for a second, seemed hesitant, but didn't show enough guilt. He showed no regret. Just surprise. As if wondering how much I had seen. The man next to her finally noticed my presence. He tried to hide it, but I saw the shadow of discomfort on his face. A shadow that confirmed everything I needed to know. "We're having fun, love," she said, and the sound of her voice felt like shattered glass inside me. She was trying to act like nothing was happening, like I was an idiot, like this was just a harmless joke. What happened next was a blur of muffled voices, whispers, and glances across the room. I didn't scream, I didn't make a fuss, but my voice was firm, cold as the ice that now coursed through my veins. He finished. "The divorce will be made official on Monday." Silence took over the environment. The music seemed distant now. She blinked, taking her time to process the words, and for the first time I saw panic in her eyes. "Wait, you're kidding, right? Do you think I'm laughing?" The man next to her cleared his throat uncomfortably. He didn't say anything. He knew there was nothing to say. The people around held their glasses, some looked away, others were glued to the scene, absorbing every detail of what was happening. It didn't matter. I didn't want to care anymore. She tried to touch my arm, but I backed away. My own body rejected the touch that was once so familiar. Now, it was like something dirty, contaminated. "It was nothing," she whispered. "Nothing." My laugh was dry, bitter. "You think I'm an idiot? How many times before this? Tell me, how long ago?" She opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. It was enough. I knew. I knew that night wasn't a slip-up, it wasn't an isolated mistake. It was just the first time I had seen it. I turned my back and left. The party continued, but for me, the world as I knew it had ended there. I didn't just feel angry at her. I felt angry with myself. Of not having noticed the signs. Of having trusted blindly. Of having believed in a love that, in the end, was not reciprocated. But fate has a cruel way of dealing with betrayal. Time reveals everything, and some truths are worse than any betrayal. Because days later, when the initial shock wore off, when the pain began to give way to clarity, that's when I found out. It was then that I understood that what happened at that party was just the tip of the iceberg. The real blow was yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is neither romanticized nor justified. The stories are fictional, but the pain, disappointment and consequences are real. Our goal is to show how betrayal destroys homes, erodes trust, and changes lives forever. Every choice has a price, and here you will see how far a lie can lead. Get ready for a shocking, intense story full of twists and turns. Now, let's get started. The night still carried the remnants of a hot day, and the city's lights reflected off the windows of tall buildings, transforming the streets into a sea of vibrant reflections. Between these buildings, in a sophisticated but cozy apartment, lived the couple who seemed to have it all. Daniel and Laura were known among friends and colleagues as a perfect couple, one that inspired admiration and, perhaps, even a little envy. Together for more than a decade, they shared a stable life, surrounded by achievements and moments that seemed solid as concrete. Daniel, a respected executive in a large company, was a methodical, ambitious man and extremely dedicated to his work. He had spent years climbing step by step, sacrificing time and leisure to ensure a prosperous future. Their efforts were rewarded with recognition and a comfortable standard of living. He was proud of what he had built and, above all, he was proud to have Laura by his side, the woman who, from the first moment, seemed to have been made for him. Laura, in turn, was a charismatic, intelligent and elegantly beautiful woman, one of those who attracted attention without needing any effort. He has always known how to balance his professional and personal life, maintaining an air of lightness even in the face of challenges. He worked in the marketing area and was extremely sociable. He knew everyone around him and was able to create connections easily. This made her a striking presence at any event, whether in a corporate environment or in casual meetings. For Daniel, her presence was essential. She brought balance to his world, broke the rigidity of his routine, and reminded him that there was more to life than just work. But recently, something seemed different. The days passed quickly, and the routine, once welcoming, had turned into a sequence of mechanical obligations. Breakfast was eaten in a hurry, goodbye kisses became distracted, and conversations were reduced to practical everyday issues. It wasn't fights or disagreements, but a subtle feeling of detachment. Daniel, always busy with meetings and deadlines, began to notice that Laura was going out alone more and more, that her smiles seemed more directed at her cell phone than at him. However, he never suspected anything other than the obvious: time was moving them apart, and perhaps they needed to do something to rekindle what was once so natural. When the company party was announced, Daniel saw an opportunity. He knew Laura loved social events, and this would be a chance to spend time together, away from the burden of work. He wanted to see her happy, he wanted to remember what brought them together, he wanted to feel like they were still connected. So he mentioned the event during dinner, hoping it would bring a sparkle to her eyes. And brought it. She smiled, quickly agreed, and even suggested that they choose what clothes they would wear together. He felt relief. Maybe it was all just in their head, maybe they were just tired, and that night was exactly what they needed to find themselves again. On the night of the party, Laura spent more time than usual getting ready. Daniel watched her as she adjusted her tie in the mirror, admiring the way it seemed to shine when she looked at herself in the reflection. Her chosen dress highlighted her curves in a sophisticated way, and the perfume she wore was the same one he liked so much, the one that always remained on his shirt after a long hug. He smiled and commented on how beautiful she looked, but, strangely, her response came quickly, as if it weren't important. "Thank you," she said, taking her bag and leading the way. A small detail, but it made him feel a slight pang in his chest. On the way to the party, the silence between them didn't seem uncomfortable, but it wasn't the same as before either. Daniel drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on his leg, occasionally glancing at Laura, who was looking at her cell phone attentively. He didn't ask what was so distracting her, but he felt an uneasiness growing inside him. Upon arrival, they were greeted by colleagues and friends. The room was impeccably decorated, the music was pleasant, and waiters circulated with glasses of champagne. Daniel busied himself greeting work partners, while Laura quickly fit in with the others. She seemed completely at ease, flowing between conversations, laughing and gesturing, while he, little by little, felt more and more like a spectator of that night. He tried to get closer, tried to include himself in her excitement, but something didn't seem to fit. Laura was distracted, and her attention seemed divided. There were times when she looked around as if searching for something, times when her smile seemed truer when she wasn't next to him. And then, it happened. Daniel picked up a glass and turned to call her, but his eyes were fixed on the scene that would change everything. A man approached Laura, and she didn't hesitate to smile at him. He touched her hand casually, pulling her to the dance floor, and she just went. There was no resistance, there was no hesitation. Just the delivery of someone who was already familiar with that touch. Daniel felt his stomach turn, his muscles tense, his chest burn with a mixture of disbelief and anger. It was like watching a nightmare in slow motion, a scenario he never imagined he would witness. The man guided her around the dance floor with confidence, and Laura seemed completely absorbed, oblivious to the fact that the most important gaze of the night was fixed on her. What happened next was a blur of emotions, an explosion of impulses and certainties that Daniel didn't want to see until then. His voice was firm, his words cut the air, and suddenly, everything around him seemed to stop. The music continued, but to him, it was just a distant noise. Everyone at the party turned their gaze to that scene, and at that moment, in front of dozens of people, he said what needed to be said. Laura's eyes widened, as if she finally understood the gravity of the situation. But it was already too late. There was no going back, there were no excuses that could erase what had already been done. And it was there, in the middle of that party, under the watchful eyes of strangers and acquaintances, that Daniel sealed the fate of the marriage that he thought was just in need of a reunion. What he didn't know, what he hadn't yet discovered, was that that night was just the surface of something much bigger. The true impact of that betrayal was yet to come, and what was about to happen would change his life forever. Daniel felt the air in the room heavy against his chest, as if the atmosphere around him had become suffocating. People's voices seemed like a distant noise, the music, once just a pleasant background, now sounded dissonant, irritating. His mind tried to rationalize, seek some justification for what his eyes had just witnessed, but nothing made sense. He could still see Laura on the dance floor, her movements fluid, her lips curved in a smile that wasn't meant for him. The man at her side, sure of himself, kept his hand firmly on her waist, guiding her in a way that Daniel had never seen anyone do with his wife. He felt the bitter taste of betrayal before he even confirmed anything. A primal instinct rose within him, something that screamed for him to step forward, to stop everything, to demand an explanation. But he held back. He was not a man of impulsive outbursts, he always acted rationally. Even so, at that moment, his rationality was hanging by a thread. He looked around and noticed that some people had also noticed the scene. Co-workers, business partners, people who respected and admired his career now glanced at the track, whispering among themselves. Laura didn't seem worried about any of this. She didn't look for Daniel in the crowd, she didn't show any kind of guilt. That was what hurt the most. There was no nervousness, no hesitation. Her body followed that man's commands as if it were something natural, as if she were already used to it. Daniel clenched his fists. He felt the muscles in his body tense, every cell of his being begging for action. But he wouldn't do anything there, not yet. He turned and left the room, feeling his chest rise and fall with heavy breaths. I needed air. He walked to one of the building's terraces, where the cold night wind hit him in the face, providing brief relief. His mind raced. He wanted to be wrong. It needed to be wrong. Everything inside him refused to accept that the woman he had shared years of his life with, the person he trusted, was doing this. But something inside him whispered an uncomfortable truth: this was nothing new to her. Minutes passed until he went back inside. The party continued as if nothing had happened, but for him, everything had changed. His eyes swept the room looking for Laura. He needed answers, he needed to confront her. But she was no longer there. Daniel's stomach dropped. He looked around, searched among the tables, the corridors. Nothing. That man was also gone. The thought came like a punch, they were together, away from prying eyes. His legs moved before his mind processed the decision. He crossed the halls of the event, opened doors, checked every possible corner. His heart was beating so hard that he could feel the pulse in his ears. Until, at the end of one of the corridors, he found a door ajar. The muffled sound of voices came from inside. He advanced with silent steps, each beat of his heart carrying the weight of confirmation he didn't want. And then he saw it. Laura, against the wall, her eyes shining in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. And the man was there, too close, holding her by the waist, his hands sliding intimately, his face close to hers. The ground disappeared beneath Daniel's feet. Time stopped. A lump rose in his throat, burning, suffocating. He couldn't look away, even when he wanted to. Every detail of that scene was engraved in his mind like a scar. Laura laughed, a sweet, guiltless sound. And then, the man lowered his head and whispered something in her ear, something that made her bite her lip, leaning into him even more. Daniel felt a raw, violent fury rise within him. But more than anger, he felt an emptiness. As if something had been ripped from him without warning. He pushed the door hard. The noise caused the two to move away in fright. Laura's eyes widened, the color draining from her face. The man next to her took a step back, but didn't seem all that surprised. He seemed prepared. Daniel's voice came out cold, cutting. I want you to look me in the eyes and tell me this isn't what it seems. Laura blinked several times, as if trying to formulate an explanation, as if looking for a way out. But there wasn't. The silence that followed was deafening. She didn't say anything. And in that moment, Daniel knew he didn't need to hear anything else. The silence between them was an abyss, a space where all the trapped words accumulated without ever being said. Daniel felt the blood pulsing in his temples, his chest rising and falling irregularly as he stared at Laura, who looked away, as if shame had finally started to catch up with her. The other man didn't move, he just remained there, observing the scene, as if he was waiting to see how far it would go. But Daniel wasn't interested in him, he didn't matter anymore. All he cared about was the woman who now seemed like a complete stranger before his eyes. Laura opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He felt a wave of contempt wash over you. For years, he had blindly trusted her, given everything, and now, at this moment, she couldn't even give him the dignity of an explanation. His voice was deep, without any trace of the tenderness that once existed. How long has it been? She swallowed hard, her eyes moving quickly, as if trying to calculate a response that would lessen the impact of what was already in front of them. But there was no softness possible, no lie that would make it any less devastating. It doesn't make any difference, she said, but her voice trailed off on the last word. Daniel felt anger burning inside, like an uncontrollable fire. Doesn't it make a difference? I dedicated years of my life to you, built a house, a family, a life by your side, and now you tell me it doesn't make a difference. She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with something that could have been guilt, but to him, it just seemed like fear of being exposed. It's not that simple. He laughed, a short, bitter laugh, without any humor. Of course it isn't. Cheating never is. But I'm not stupid, Laura. I saw the way you were. This didn't happen yesterday, this wasn't a moment of impulse. So why don't you have the decency to admit it? The man beside her crossed his arms, taking a deep breath, as if finally deciding he should intervene. Do you really want to do this here? Daniel slowly turned his face towards him, his gaze filled with something that made the other take a step back. Oh, yes, I want to. You had the courage to touch my wife behind my back, but now you want discretion. How convenient. Laura took a step forward, as if trying to calm the situation, but Daniel didn't move. He wanted the truth, he wanted her to say it in so many words, to admit what was already written there, so that there would be no more room for illusions. It was a mistake, she began, but he raised his hand, interrupting her. Don't insult me with that. A mistake is forgetting an appointment, missing time for a meeting. A mistake is not getting involved with another man behind my back. She pursed her lips, her fingers trembling slightly. Daniel realized that, despite everything, she was still trying to find a way to get out of that situation without completely falling apart. But he had already been torn to pieces. Do you want the truth? She asked, her voice firmer now. He crossed his arms, waiting. I didn't want it to be like this. But it happened, and I got more involved than I should have. Daniel's muscles tensed, as if every part of his body was preparing to absorb the impact of what came next. More than it should be. So tell me, Laura, what exactly does this mean? She hesitated. We've known each other for some time. It was after you started traveling more, when your work started to take up more space than our lives. I felt alone, and then, it happened. Daniel felt something inside him break. So it's my fault now. She shook her head quickly. That's not what I meant. But, you've changed. You became distant. He laughed again, but this time there was pain in the sound. I changed because I was working to guarantee what we built. You know that I always did everything thinking about our future. And in the middle of it, you forgot about me, she whispered. The sentence hung in the air between them, heavy, loaded with meaning. But Daniel felt no empathy, felt nothing but frustration. If you were unhappy, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you try to fix it instead of destroying everything? She took a deep breath, as if searching for an answer that made sense, but he no longer wanted to hear it. And what were you planning? Continue like this until when? Or were you going to wait for me to find out like an idiot? Laura looked away, and he knew in that instant. She wouldn't have stopped. If he hadn't seen it, if he hadn't sensed something was wrong, she would have carried on as if nothing had happened. Betrayal alone was enough to tear him apart. But it was the realization that she never planned to tell him, never thought about being honest with him, that completely destroyed him. He felt his body heavy, as if something inside him had been ripped out and left a void that was impossible to fill. The silence between them became unbearable. Laura took a hesitant step, as if she wanted to say something more, but he raised his hand again. No. There is nothing more to be said. And then, without looking back, Daniel turned his back and left. The night air was cold against his skin, but nothing could ease the heat of the pain that burned inside him. Everything he thought was right, everything he believed to be real, had crumbled. But there was something Laura didn't know. Something that would change everything again. She thought the worst part had already happened. She was wrong. Daniel left the building feeling the cold night wind cutting his face, but nothing was enough to put out the fire that burned inside him. His steps were fast, heavy, guided by a dull anger that pulsed through his veins. He didn't know exactly where he was going, he just knew he needed to get out of there. His chest rose and fell with short breaths, filled with frustration, pain and a contained fury that threatened to overflow at any moment. The world around them seemed to continue at the same indifferent pace as always. People walked along the sidewalks, cars passed with bright headlights cutting through the darkness, some laughter echoed from nearby bars and restaurants. How was it possible for everything to remain the same when everything inside him had been destroyed? He stopped on the sidewalk, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the chaos inside him. But how to contain something that had already broken into pieces? His phone vibrated in his pocket, bringing him back to reality. He picked up the device and saw Laura's name on the screen. Just seeing her name lit up made him feel nauseous. He ignored the call, clenching his fists at his sides. A minute later, another call. And then another. He hung up the phone, not having the patience to hear more lies, more empty justifications. He continued walking, without a clear destination, until he found himself in front of the building itself. The last thing I wanted was to go back home, to the place where everything reminded me of Laura, where every piece of furniture, every smell, every detail screamed her name. But where else could it go? He entered the building's lobby, walking steadily, without even noticing the doorman greeting him. He went up in the elevator, the seconds dragging by as he stared at his own reflection in the cabin mirror. His face was different, harder, colder. He barely recognized himself. When the elevator door opened, he hurried out and unlocked the apartment door with a single movement. Upon entering, the familiarity of the environment hit him like a punch. The pictures on the wall, the soft lighting, her smell still permeating the air. He ran a hand over his face, feeling a sudden tiredness come over him. Everything seemed to lose its meaning now. But then, a noise. He froze. It came from the room. His heart raced differently now, no longer out of anger, but out of a strange sense of alertness. He walked down the hall, his steps slow, precise. When he pushed open the bedroom door, he saw her suitcase on the bed. Laura was there, her hands were shaking, her eyes were red like someone who had been crying. She looked up when she saw him, but he felt nothing when he looked at her. No compassion, no affection. "You don't answer my calls," she said, her voice breaking. He remained where he was, arms crossed, watching her every move coldly. "What are you doing here?" She took a deep breath, as if she needed to gather the courage to speak. "I needed to see you. I needed to explain." He let out a dry laugh. "Explain? What exactly?" "Because I think I saw everything I needed to see." She lowered her eyes, biting her lip hard. "Daniel, please. It's not just what you saw." He took a step forward, his patience running out quickly. "So tell me, Laura. What else do I need to know?" She hesitated, her hands clenching at her sides. When he looked up again, there was something there that he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't just regret. It was fear. "You have to know," she began, her voice trembling. But before she could continue, a sound interrupted everything. Laura's cell phone vibrated on the bedside table. Daniel looked away from the screen. And that's when everything became clear. The name flashing on the screen was not that of the man he had seen her with at the party. It wasn't him. It was another name. A name he knew well. His eyes widened, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to freeze. He looked back at Laura, who was no longer trying to hide the truth. "What?" he began, but the words died in his throat. Laura closed her eyes, tears falling silently down her face. "That's what I need to tell you." The silence that came after was heavy, suffocating. Daniel felt the weight of betrayal multiply inside him. Because now it wasn't just a question of infidelity. It was something bigger, something much worse. And the truth that was about to be told would change everything forever. The air in the room felt thick, almost impossible to breathe. Daniel felt the weight of that revelation pressing down on his chest, as his mind desperately tried to connect the dots that had previously seemed loose. The name that flashed on Laura's cell phone screen still shone in the darkness of the room, cruel and definitive, indisputable proof that his betrayal went far beyond what he imagined. His eyes, fixed on that name, burned as if they had been burned. Every beat of his heart sounded like a blow, every breath became more labored. He blinked, looking away at Laura, who now seemed smaller, fragile, her posture hunched over as if trying to hide from the truth that was about to be told. But there was no longer anywhere to hide. The silence was broken by the sound of her rapid breathing. Laura bit her lower lip hard, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if waiting for him to speak first, for him to give voice to the destruction that now hovered between them. But Daniel couldn't. The words were stuck, crushed by the weight of disappointment and silent fury that consumed him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to organize his own thoughts, but everything inside him screamed. Every memory shared, every gesture of affection, every promise made over the years now seemed like a blatant lie. And the worst of all is that he knew it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that had happened on impulse. It had deep roots, a carefully guarded secret, kept in the shadows while he lived in the illusion of a stable marriage. When she opened her eyes again, Laura was still there, waiting, her shaking hands holding her wrist as if that could stop her from falling apart. But he no longer cared about her breakdown. Not after what he had discovered. How long has it been? The question was low, almost a whisper, but carried with a weight that was impossible to ignore. Laura hesitated for a moment, and that moment was enough for him to know that he didn't want to hear the answer. But she came anyway. Longer than I care to admit. Daniel felt the impact of those words piercing his chest like a sharp blade. More time. Longer than she would like to admit. Did that mean years? Did it mean that while he was trying hard to build a life with her, while he believed they were just going through a difficult period, she was already involved with someone else? He ran a hand over his face, trying to contain the storm of emotions that threatened to explode. His mind was spinning, trying to understand, trying to find a reason, a justification that would make it hurt less. But there wasn't. "You lied to me all this time," he said, his voice empty, emotionless. Laura closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples. "I didn't want it to be like this. But it was." Silence fell over them again, and Daniel felt something inside him shift. The pain was still there, but there was something more now. A growing emptiness, a dark clarity that made everything seem ridiculously simple. He looked her up and down, seeing her differently now, as someone he'd never really met. Who else knew? She hesitated, and her hesitation was a confession. "My God," he laughed, a dry, bitter laugh. "Until that? How many people did you make me look like an idiot, Laura?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." He turned his back, running his hands through his hair, trying to contain the anger that was growing like an out-of-control fire. Every time she opened her mouth, every time she tried to soften the situation, the more disgust he felt. "I loved you," he said, turning back to her. "With everything I had. I never, ever imagined that you could do something like that to me." Laura sobbed, and he felt angry about it. Because now it didn't matter anymore. Now it was too late for tears, too late for regrets. "I know nothing I say will fix this," she whispered, looking at him with desperate eyes. Daniel shook his head, feeling the bitter taste of disappointment in his mouth. "You still talk like there's something that needs to be fixed. But there isn't." He looked around the room, the same room that had once been a refuge, a home, but now looked like a destroyed battlefield. Nothing there seemed real. Nothing else mattered. Laura took a deep breath, wiping away her tears with a shaking hand. "You may hate me, you may never want to see me again, but I can't change what happened." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, finally, he felt something different emerge within him. Acceptance. Not the betrayal, not the lie, but the fact that this was the end. "I don't hate you," he said, and for the first time, his voice sounded calm, as if a gigantic weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "But I don't care anymore either." Laura's eyes widened, as if those words hit her more than any accusation or scream. He turned, walking to the door. He didn't need anything else there. "I didn't need explanations, I didn't need justifications." He already had everything he needed to move forward. Before leaving, he paused one last time, without looking back. "I hope it was worth it." And then he left. And this time, he wouldn't come back. Daniel left the apartment without looking back, quickly going down the stairs, as if he needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere that Laura left behind. The cold night air hit his face as he crossed the building's entrance, but not even the icy breeze was enough to ease the fire that still burned inside him. His chest rose and fell irregularly, and no matter how much he tried to organize his thoughts, everything became confused in a confusion of emotions that left him on the verge of collapse. The betrayal in itself was a difficult blow to bear, but what hurt most was the extent of the deception. Not only did he lose his wife, but he realized that trust, the foundation that supported the entire relationship, never truly existed. His steps took him to a nearby bar, a discreet place where he knew he could sink into the drink without being bothered by familiar faces. He sat at the counter, asking the barman for a double whiskey, who just nodded and served him without questions. He twirled the glass between his fingers for a moment before taking the first sip, feeling the hot alcohol go down his throat, burning in a way that almost seemed to bring momentary relief. But it was just that, momentary. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket, and he already knew who it was before he even looked at the screen. He ignored it. Minutes later, another call. He ignored it again. Laura wouldn't give up so easily, and he knew that. But there was nothing more to be said. What else could she justify? What else could be explained without him feeling even more destroyed? A voice beside him caught his attention, briefly breaking him out of his thoughts. Rough night? He turned his face and saw a woman sitting next to him. He had an attentive, curious look, but without that trace of invasion that many people had when they tried to get involved where they weren't invited. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Something like that. She tilted her head slightly, watching him for a moment before taking a sip of her own drink. The way you hold that glass, like it's the only thing keeping you upright, says it was something worse than a bad day at work. He ran a hand over his face, too exhausted to try to mask anything. I discovered that my wife was not who I thought she was. The woman didn't say anything right away. He just nodded, as if he understood exactly the weight of what that meant. I've been there, she said, after a moment. There's nothing anyone can say to you right now that will make the pain go away. Daniel looked at her again, for the first time actually paying attention. There was something in her eyes, something that indicated that these weren't just empty words from someone trying to make conversation. She knew. She's already been there. How did you deal with it? She gave a brief smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. At first, I tried to understand. I tried to find a reason, an explanation. But over time, I realized that some people simply make choices that have nothing to do with us. They cheat, lie, deceive, and no matter how hard we try, it will never be enough to stop it. Daniel stared at his own glass for a moment, absorbing her words. Did you get over it? She took a deep breath before responding. Yes. But it took a while. The silence between them was comfortable. For the first time that night, Daniel felt that he was not completely alone in his pain. He stayed there for a few more hours, just letting the drink numb his senses. When he finally left the bar, the sky was already starting to lighten. His body was heavy, his head was spinning, but for the first time since everything happened, he felt like he could breathe without each inhale hurting. He took a taxi and went straight to a hotel. He wouldn't come home. I couldn't bear to go into that apartment again. He needed space, he needed a place where he could collect himself without the ghosts of the recent past haunting him at every turn. The next few days were a mix of numbness and brutal reality. He avoided looking at his cell phone, avoided any contact with Laura. But eventually, he knew he would have to face her again. The divorce needed to happen. And most of all, he needed to free himself completely from her. When he finally answered one of his calls, it was just to arrange a meeting with the lawyers. She tried to speak, tried to convince him to listen once more. But he no longer wanted to hear anything else. He no longer cared about their justifications, their requests for forgiveness. On the day of the meeting, he walked into the law firm's conference room without looking at Laura, without even hesitating. She was sitting there, at the table, her eyes red and swollen, but he no longer felt the same weight in his chest when he saw her like that. She made her choice. He would do his. The lawyer began the proceedings, going through the terms of the agreement point by point. Daniel just nodded, signing where he needed to, without going into details. He wanted this resolved. I wanted to move on. When the last document was signed, Laura finally spoke, her voice brittle. So that's it? He looked up, meeting hers for the first time in that room. Always was. You just didn't realize it before. And then, without another word, he got up and left. The weight he carried on his shoulders finally began to disappear as he walked out of that building. It wasn't a complete relief, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something Laura would never have again, a future without lies. Time passed, and with it, the pain gave way to something colder, more distant. Daniel no longer felt that crushing weight in his chest when remembering everything that happened, but the emptiness remained. Not a void of sadness, but of liberation. He had closed the doors to his past, cut the ties that bound him to a well-constructed lie, and now, for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe without the shadow of betrayal haunting him. The divorce had been made official without much fanfare. Laura signed the papers without contesting, without asking for more explanations, just accepting the destiny that she created for herself. She tried a few times to talk to him, tried to find ways to justify it, to redeem herself for something that was beyond repair. But each attempt was ignored. He didn't need to hear it anymore. Moving apartments came soon after. Daniel could no longer bear to be in that shared space, where every corner was permeated with her memory. He found a new place, smaller, more discreet, but it finally felt like his own. There was no longer the smell of her perfume on every piece of furniture, or the clothes mixed together in the closet. It was an empty space, ready to be filled with new life. And he was in no hurry. The days were different now. There were no more good morning messages that once seemed automatic, no more rushed phone calls just to maintain the formality of a wedding. His time was his alone. He started going out more, meeting old friends that he had somehow left aside in the years of their relationship. He realized he had lost more than just a marriage. He had lost himself. Now, he found small pieces of who he was before Laura, rebuilding himself from the ruins. Laura, on the other hand, felt the effects of her choices in a slow and destructive way. The man he risked everything for was no longer there. He never was. After the divorce scandal came to light, their relationship quickly fell apart. Without the thrill of secrecy, without the adrenaline of a forbidden affair, what was left was an empty relationship, without foundations. The man who once held her firmly now barely answered her calls, and the charm she thought existed between them dissolved into the reality of a betrayal that never had a future. She tried to get her life back on track, to pretend she still had control over things, but the consequences were relentless. The betrayal was not forgotten by those around him. The judgmental looks at work, the veiled comments between colleagues, it all felt like a constant reminder of the mistake he made. People who previously saw her as a reference now avoided her. His career began to slowly crumble, and loneliness became his only companion. Daniel found out about this from a third party, but he didn't care. There was no satisfaction in seeing Laura fall apart, just the realization that life always takes its due. He didn't want revenge, he didn't feel the need to see her suffer. Her biggest victory was simply moving forward without carrying the weight of what she did. And moving forward brought surprises. Between meeting friends and new experiences, Daniel met someone. It wasn't something planned, nor something that happened in an intense or dramatic way. It was simple. Natural. As if life, after so much chaos, was giving him a second chance. Unlike Laura, this woman didn't carry secrets with her, she didn't seem like an enigma to be deciphered. She was transparent, real, and with her, Daniel felt light. For the first time, he realized that love didn't have to be a constant battle, it didn't have to be a game of trials and frustrations. It was something that flowed effortlessly. The past was still there, marked in his history, but it no longer defined him. He learned the hardest lesson of his life, but came out of it stronger. The man who walked into that company party, believing he had a solid marriage, died that night. But in his place, someone new was born. Someone who learned to recognize their own value, who understood that another person's betrayal will never be a reflection of the person who was betrayed, but rather of the person who betrayed them. Laura never tried to look for him again after a while. Maybe because I knew nothing I said could change what happened. Or maybe because he finally understood what he lost. Life went on, as it always does. Daniel continued on his way, now without looking back. And Laura stayed exactly where she chose to be. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Comment your opinion, I want to know what you think about all this. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remember, here, betrayal is never romanticized. Consequences always arrive.